A single sealed decision inside Buckingham Palace removed Princess Charlotte's name from an official family portrait list, and the person who signed it was not the king. It was not a matter of protocol that shook the household that morning. It was the fact that a stepmother had reached into a bloodline she did not carry and touched a child she did not raise. The corridors did not echo with argument. The staff did not whisper in doorways. A single folder moved from one desk to another, and inside it a small line had been drawn through a 9-year-old's name, and that line, thin as thread, carried the weight of a constitutional tremor. For those who understood the machinery of the crown, the gesture was not administrative. It was territorial. Before we go deeper into what this really means, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The room in which the decision was first spoken aloud was small, wood-paneled, and older than most of the arguments the monarchy had survived. There were 3 chairs and one long table. On that table sat a leather portfolio, closed, its brass clasp catching the last of the winter light. Queen Camilla entered first, her steps measured, her expression composed in that particular way she had learned to wear over decades. The way of a woman who had once been the outsider, and had trained herself never to appear so again. She did not sit immediately. She placed one gloved hand on the back of her chair, and she waited. That mattered because in that household, the person who stood longest set the tone of the meeting, and she had learned that lesson from a queen who was no longer alive to correct her. The portrait in question was not a casual family photograph. It was, in the language of the palace, a sanctioned composition, meaning an image commissioned for archival record, intended to hang in a stateroom and to be reproduced on official stationery for a generation. A sanctioned composition, in simple terms, is a photograph that becomes history the moment the shutter closes. To be included in it was to be written into the visual bloodline of the monarchy. To be excluded was to be quietly unwritten. And on the list that lay inside the leather portfolio, one name had been struck through with a single, deliberate stroke of black ink: Charlotte, Elizabeth. Diana. For Queen Camilla, the decision was not, in her own private reasoning, an act of cruelty. It was a curation. She had convinced herself, through weeks of careful internal rehearsal, that a portrait of the working monarchy should reflect only those who actively served it. And a 9-year-old, however beloved, did not yet serve. For King Charles, when the folder reached him hours later, the decision registered differently. He read the struck name, and he felt the small, cold recognition of a man who had spent a lifetime watching women he loved rewrite the rooms he inhabited. For Prince William, when the news arrived through a private channel he had cultivated precisely for moments like this, the reaction was neither anger nor surprise. It was the quiet, hardening clarity of a father who had promised his daughter, in a whispered vow years earlier, that no institution would ever teach her she was less. And for Princess Catherine, who learned of it last, the moment landed as a mother's moment always lands, in the stomach first, in the throat second, and in the resolve third. To understand why this carried such force, the story must return to a dinner held 11 months earlier, in a private dining room at Highgrove, where the family had gathered for what was described in the schedule only as an informal supper. There had been 6 people at the table. There had been one empty chair, left in place out of habit, once belonging to the late Queen. Camilla had sat at the head. William had sat at the far end. Between them, in the middle of the long table, Charlotte had been seated beside her grandfather, and she had spoken, in the clear, unguarded voice of a child who had not yet learned to measure her sentences, about a drawing she had made of the family. In her drawing, she had explained, everyone was holding hands. Everyone included the late Queen. Everyone included her mother. Everyone included Camilla. And Camilla, according to a documented private account later relayed by a member of household staff, had smiled the smile of a woman who had just been reminded, gently and without malice, that she was one figure among many in a story she did not author. That evening had ended without incident. There had been no raised voices, no cold departures, no slammed doors. But something had shifted at that table, something so small that only 3 people in the room had noticed it, and only one of them had recorded it. In a family memorandum later preserved among William's private papers, the moment was described in a single line. She spoke, and the room adjusted. That line, spare and clinical, would come to explain everything that followed. The confrontation, when it finally came, did not happen in a stateroom. It happened in a corridor. William had walked the length of the East Wing without an aide, without a phone, without the usual quiet retinue that trailed him through the palace. He had asked, through a single message sent to a single secretary, for 5 minutes. Camilla had granted them. She had been standing by a tall window when he entered, her back to the door, a cup of tea untouched on the sill beside her. She did not turn immediately. That mattered because in the choreography of royal encounters, the one who turns last claims the higher ground, and she had learned that from a king who was still alive to watch her use it. William did not sit. He did not raise his voice. He did not produce the folder, though the folder was in his jacket pocket, folded once, its edges softened by the heat of his body. He said only one sentence, and the sentence was not a question. "My daughter's name goes back on the list." Camilla turned then. She looked at him for a long moment, and in that moment she saw, perhaps for the first time, that the boy she had once watched grow up in the shadow of another woman's memory had become a man who no longer required her permission to protect his own child. She did not argue. She did not defend the curation. She said quietly that she had believed she was acting in the interest of the institution. William replied, in a voice so low that the secretary standing 3 rooms away later swore she had felt it more than heard it. That the institution was his daughter's inheritance, not her editorial project. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. It was the kind of silence that ends a chapter. Within the hour, the machinery began to move. The leather portfolio was retrieved from the archival office. The struck line through Charlotte's name was overwritten with a fresh entry, this time in William's own hand. A small, deliberate act of restoration that would be preserved in the palace's internal record for as long as the record existed. A schedule was reissued. A photographer's briefing was amended. A card that had been removed from a seating plan for a related state event was quietly reinserted, and the empty chair that had briefly appeared on a draft floor plan was folded back into the composition. These were small objects, a folder, a card, a chair. But in the language of the palace, small objects carry the weight that words are forbidden to carry. And the reinsertion of each one was a sentence in a paragraph no one would ever be permitted to read aloud. The staff noticed first, they always did. A senior member of household, standing in the corridor outside the archival office, watched the portfolio pass from one hand to another and understood, without being told, that a line had been redrawn. That mattered because in a house where nothing is ever said directly, the movement of objects is the only honest language, and the objects that morning were speaking of a father who had refused to let his daughter be quietly unwritten. The second warning arrived 2 days later, and it did not come from William. It came from Catherine. She had asked, through the same private channel her husband had used, for a private audience with Camilla, and she had asked for it in a tone that could not be declined. The meeting took place in a sitting room on the first floor, a room chosen precisely because it had no listening staff and no ceremonial function. Catherine did not sit. She stood by the fireplace, her hands folded in front of her, her expression composed in the way of a woman who had spent years learning to keep her face still while her interior was moving. She spoke for less than 4 minutes. She did not raise the portrait. She did not raise the folder. She raised instead a single memory of the late queen who had once told her in a conversation held in a garden that the strength of the crown was measured not by who it elevated, but by who it protected. And then Catherine had said softly that she would not permit her daughter to become the child the crown had failed to protect. Camilla had listened. She had not replied. And when Catherine had left the room, Camilla had remained by the fireplace for a long time, and the tea on the mantelpiece had gone cold, and the winter light through the tall window had faded. And the palace had continued to move around her in the way that palaces do, indifferent to the private erosion of the people inside them. That evening, in a private wing of Kensington, William and Catherine sat together in a room that carried no titles. There was no protocol in that room. There were no aides. There were 2 people and a low lamp. and a child asleep upstairs, and a decision that had already been made but had not yet been spoken. William did not speak first. He rarely did in that room. Catherine placed her hand on his, and she said, in a voice that carried none of the composure she wore in corridors, that she had waited too long. William replied that they both had. That mattered because in the private grammar of a marriage that had survived more institutional pressure than most marriages survive in a lifetime, waiting too long was the closest either of them came to admitting fear. They did not speak of Camilla by name. They did not speak of the folder. They spoke, instead, of their daughter, and of the drawing she had once made in which everyone was holding hands, and of the small, unbearable weight of watching a child learn, before she was ready, that not everyone in a family drawing agrees to hold hands back. The room in which that conversation ended was quiet for a long time afterward. The lamp burned low. Catherine did not move. William did not either. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck the hour, and the sound of it, small and precise, marked the end of a private grief that would never be spoken of again. When they finally rose, they rose together, and they went upstairs, and they stood for a moment in the doorway of their daughter's room, and they watched her sleep, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that a line drawn through her name in a leather portfolio would never, as long as they lived, be permitted to become a line drawn through her life. By the following morning, the story had begun to move in the way that stories move when a palace tries to contain them. There were no press releases. There were no leaks in the conventional sense. There was, instead, a slow atmospheric shift in the tone of the coverage, a shift so subtle that only the most experienced correspondents noticed it, and even they did not, at first, understand what they were noticing. A photograph of Charlotte, previously scheduled for release the following week, appeared instead, on the morning of the amended portrait sitting. A caption, drafted by a communications officer working under instructions no one would later be able to trace, described her, for the first time in official language, as a central figure in the family's public life. Central. Not peripheral, not junior. Central. That single word, in the vocabulary of palace communications, was not decoration. It was a correction, and it was intended to be read as one. The public did not know the story. The public would never know the full story. But the public felt it, in the way that publics always feel these things, through a slow accumulation of small signals. A crowd gathered outside the palace gates on the afternoon of the portrait sitting, drawn there by nothing more specific than a sense that something had happened. A woman standing near the railings, holding the hand of a small girl in a red coat, spoke to a passing broadcaster in a voice that carried the particular weight of unrehearsed feeling. She said only that she was glad the little princess was in the picture. She said it once. She did not elaborate. And the broadcaster, who had covered the family for more than 2 decades, understood that she had just been given the only quote that would matter that day. The newspaper front pages the following morning carried the photograph. They did not carry the story behind it. One paper, a broadsheet with a long institutional memory, ran a single line beneath the image in a typeface reserved for moments of quiet significance. A family restored. That was all. Byline. No explanation. No mention of the folder, the corridor, the fireplace, the lamp. Just 3 words, and a photograph, and a nation reading between them without knowing what it was reading between. Inside the palace, the machinery continued to move. The leather portfolio was returned to the archival office, its brass clasp closed, its contents reordered. The struck line through Charlotte's name had been overwritten so carefully that it could no longer be seen without a lamp held close to the page, and even then it appeared only as a faint shadow beneath the fresh ink, a ghost of a decision that had lasted less than 72 hours. That mattered because, in the archival language of the Crown, a decision that leaves a shadow is a decision that has been overruled, and the shadow, however faint, is preserved deliberately, so that future readers of the record will know that a line was drawn and then unwritten, and that the unwriting was itself an act of history. Camilla did not appear at the portrait sitting. Her absence was explained, in a briefing note circulated to a small number of senior aides, as a scheduling matter. A scheduling matter, in the vocabulary of the palace, is the phrase used when the truth is neither to be denied nor spoken. She spent the afternoon in her private study, a room she had furnished herself over the course of 2 decades, and she read, or appeared to read, a book she had already finished. On the small table beside her chair sat a cup of tea, and beside the cup sat a photograph unframed of the late Queen, taken many years earlier in a garden. Camilla did not look at the photograph directly. She did not need to. She had spent long enough in that house to understand that the woman in the photograph was still, in ways that could not be measured or contested, the author of the room she now occupied, and that the small line she had drawn through a 9-year-old's name had been, in the end, a line drawn through her own standing in a story she had never fully been permitted to write. For William, the afternoon was different. He stood beside his daughter as the photographer worked, and he did not speak, and he did not smile in the way he was expected to smile, and he did not look at the camera except when instructed. He looked instead at Charlotte. He watched her stand in her small, carefully chosen dress, her hair braided by her mother that morning, her hands folded in the way she had been taught to fold them, and he saw in her face the particular composure of a child who did not yet know that a battle had been fought over her. And he understood, with the clarity that comes only to parents in the presence of their own children, that his job for the rest of his life would be to ensure she never had to know. For Charlotte, the afternoon was simply an afternoon. She stood where she was asked to stand. She held her hands where she was asked to hold them. She looked at the camera when the photographer counted down, and she did not look at it when he did not. She thought, for a moment during a long pause between exposures, about the drawing she had once made of the family holding hands, and she wondered, briefly, whether she should make another one, and then the photographer counted down again, and she looked at the camera, and the shutter closed, and the image that would hang in a state room for a generation was made, and in it she was central. And she was steady, and she was, in every measurable and unmeasurable sense, exactly where she had always belonged. For Catherine, standing just outside the frame, watching her daughter through the small square of a monitor set up by the photographer's assistant, the afternoon was the completion of a promise she had made to herself in a hospital room 9 years earlier. She had promised, in that room, holding a newborn whose name had not yet been announced, that the child in her arms would never be made small by the institution she had married into. She had kept that promise imperfectly, as all such promises are kept, through years of quiet vigilance and occasional public sacrifice. But on that afternoon, watching her daughter stand central in a sanctioned composition, she felt the particular relief of a mother who has at last been able to keep a promise fully. For King Charles, watching the sitting from a doorway he did not enter, the afternoon was more complicated. He saw his granddaughter. He saw his son. He saw the empty space in the composition where his wife had been scheduled to stand. And he understood that the empty space was not an accident, and that it had been arranged with a discretion so precise that no one would ever be able to prove it, by a communications team acting on an instruction he had not given but had not countermanded. That mattered because in the language of the Crown, an instruction not countermanded is an instruction endorsed, and he had, in the small deliberate act of not intervening, permitted a correction he could not himself have publicly delivered. He watched for a long moment. He did not enter the room. He turned, eventually, and walked back down the corridor, and the sound of his footsteps on the polished floor was, to the one member of staff who heard it, the sound of a father choosing, at last, the son he had not always known how to choose. The days that followed were quiet. There were no statements, there were no clarifications. There was, instead, the slow settling of a household that had, in the space of less than a week, moved through a private constitutional adjustment without a single public word being spoken. The portrait was framed, it was hung, it was reproduced on stationery. It appeared in the corner of a broadcast the following month, behind a presenter reading a routine bulletin, and no one watching the broadcast understood that the image behind the presenter's shoulder carried, in its composition, the outcome of a corridor conversation that had lasted less than 4 minutes. But those inside the household understood. They understood in the way that people who live inside institutions always understand, through the small daily rearrangements of objects and schedules and seating plans. A card that had been removed was reinserted. A chair that had been folded was unfolded. A folder that had been struck was overwritten. And in the archival office, on a shelf where such things were kept, the leather portfolio was returned to its place, and the small faint shadow beneath the fresh ink was preserved, deliberately, so that a future archivist running a lamp along the page would know that a decision had been made and then unmade, and that the unmaking had been, in its own quiet way, the moment a father had drawn a line that no one, not even a queen, would be permitted to cross again. The public reaction in the weeks that followed was not dramatic. It did not need to be. It arrived in the form of a slow warming, a subtle shift in the tone of coverage, a small increase in the number of photographs of Charlotte released through official channels, a careful recalibration of the language used to describe her role. Central, beloved, present. These were not accidental words. They were the vocabulary of restoration. And they were deployed with the precision of an institution that had understood, at last, that the child at the center of the portrait was not a peripheral figure to be curated, but a bloodline to be protected. A civilian woman standing outside the palace gates weeks later, holding again the hand of the small girl in the red coat, spoke to a different broadcaster in a different voice. She said that she had always believed the little princess belonged in the picture. She said it with the quiet certainty of a person who had never doubted it. And she did not know, and would never know, that her certainty had been fought for in a corridor by a father who had walked its length alone. A broadsheet columnist, writing months later in a piece nominally about something else, closed her column with a single sentence that would be remembered longer than the column itself. In every family, she wrote, there is a moment when the adults decide who the children will be permitted to become. That sentence was not attributed to any source inside the palace. It did not need to be. Those who understood the story understood the sentence. Those who did not understand the story read past it without pausing. And the sentence sat quietly in the archive of the newspaper, waiting for a future reader to find it and to understand at last what it had meant. Inside the palace, life resumed. Camilla continued her duties. She attended engagements. She smiled in the way she had trained herself to smile. She stood, at state occasions, in the position she had been assigned, and she performed the role she had, over decades, earned the right to perform. But something had shifted, and she knew it, and the household knew it, and William knew it most of all. The shift was not visible in any photograph. It was not audible in any statement. It was present, instead, in the small daily choreography of the palace, in the order of entrances, in the distribution of folders, in the seating of dinners, in the composition of portraits. She had drawn a line, and the line had been unwritten, and the unwriting had rearranged, permanently and invisibly, the geometry of a family she had spent 30 years learning to belong to. For William, the shift was different. He did not celebrate. He did not gloat. He did not, in any public or private forum, refer to the corridor conversation, the folder, the fireplace, the lamp. He returned to his duties with the same measured composure he had always carried, and he stood beside his wife at engagements, and he watched his daughter grow, and he understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had once been the child at the center of another family's quiet reordering, that the greatest protection he could offer Charlotte was not vigilance but ordinariness. He wanted her to grow up believing, as long as it was possible for her to believe it, that no one had ever tried to unright her, because the belief itself would be the shield that no institution could pierce. For Catherine, the shift was quieter still. She resumed her mornings with her children. She braided her daughter's hair. She helped with schoolwork. She stood at school gates in the way she had always stood at school gates, composed and present and unremarkable, in the way she had chosen to be unremarkable. But in the evenings, when the children were asleep, she sometimes sat by a window in a private room, and she looked out at the garden, and she thought about the promise she had made in a hospital 9 years earlier, and she understood that the promise had been tested, and that she had passed the test, and that the passing had cost her something she would never be able to name. For Charlotte, life continued as it had always continued. She grew, she learned, she drew. She made, in the months following the portrait sitting, another drawing of the family, and in the drawing everyone was holding hands, and everyone included her grandfather, and everyone included her mother, and everyone included her father, and everyone included in a small figure at the edge of the composition, drawn with the particular generosity of a child who had not been taught to withhold Camilla. She showed the drawing to her mother. Her mother looked at it for a long moment, and she smiled, and she said that it was beautiful, and she meant it, and she folded the drawing carefully and placed it in a drawer where such things were kept. And the drawer, in that house, was more sacred than any archive the palace maintained. The portrait itself hangs, now, in a stateroom where such portraits hang. Visitors pass it without pausing. Guides mention it in the brief professional tones that guides use. The image records a family, it records a moment, it records, to the eye of a casual observer, nothing more than a routine composition of a working monarchy. But to those who know the story, and there are very few who know the full story, the portrait records something else. It records a line that was drawn and then unwritten. It records a father who walked a corridor alone. It records a mother who stood by a fireplace and spoke of protection. It records a king who watched from a doorway and chose, at last, the son he loved. It records a queen who learned, in the quiet aftermath of a curation that failed, that the family she had married into was, in the end, a family that would not permit her to author it. And it records, at its center, a child who did not know any of this, and who stood where she was asked to stand, and who looked at the camera when the photographer counted down, and who was, in every sense that would ever matter, exactly where she had always belonged. Camilla gave the institution her discipline. Charles gave it his silence. Catherine gave it her honesty. William gave it his line. And Charlotte, without knowing it, gave it its grace, the small, ordinary grace of a child who continued to draw families in which everyone held hands, even when the adults around her had briefly forgotten how. That, in the end, was the correction. That was the restoration. That was the private constitutional adjustment that no press release would ever describe and no historian would ever fully reconstruct. It happened in a corridor, in a sitting room, in a nursery, in a drawer. It happened in the movement of a folder, the reinsertion of a card, the unfolding of a chair, the overwriting of a line. It happened in the small, deliberate acts of people who understood that a family, in the end, is not what is composed in a portrait, but what is preserved in the drawings a child keeps making, year after year, in which everyone is holding hands. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next.